And we have none other than Dave Dabberton, my brother, local attorney who is the president of the United Citizens Association, and he's here to talk about his book, Walkable, Rideable, Whiting Robertsdale, and also to talk about some of the events that we have today, starting today in downtown Whiting, in celebration of Home for the Holidays. So good morning, David.
Good morning, Tom.
David, you wrote, actually, this is your second edition of a book that you wrote called Walkable, Rideable, Whiting and Robertsdale. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think the real title is the one I think is the important part, which is that it's not only walkable, rideable, Whiting, and Robertsdale. It's called A Field Guide to the Most Interesting Community in America. And I know that's hyperbole. I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I stand by it. I've seen a lot of the world.
Rick and I would know anything about exaggeration, would we?
No, not us.
Well, I've seen a lot of the world, and I have to say that whenever anybody asks me about why I wrote this, I tell them the same story, which is, I get to travel. I get to travel all over the world, and I can't tell you how many times I've been at some far-off-flung country and listening to some local historian talk about their community and listening to all the tourists, especially the Americans, saying, ooh and ah, and gee, this is fascinating. And Chris, my wife, I'd say, I think Whiting's just as interesting as that. Nobody's oohing and ahhing. So we did the first edition of this, I think it was back in the early 90s, and it was just kind of a stapled book together. And it started off, we were doing it just as a walking tour and a riding tour, a bicycle tour of Whiting and Robertsdale, which is a great community for walking and a great community for riding your bike. I mean, you can't really, there's no hills, which is great for people like me with bad knees, but it's set up very well for walking and riding. And we started there, and then it kind of built on that. And what you have now, I think, that book could easily be 4 times as large as it is. I mean, there's so many things about the history of Whiting and Robertsdale. There's so many things about the history of Northwest Indiana that we miss. We're overshadowed by Chicago, of course. All of our history seems to be good. If it's good history or interesting history, it seems to be absorbed into the history of Chicago, or we're overlooked completely by the rest of the state of Indiana because they don't consider us part of the state. So we really are sort of left out over here. And I think it's, to me, the history of your community, any community is great. And I think the history of Whiting and Robertsdale, there's a lot of fascinating stuff that occurred there. And again, it's not written so much, it's an armchair adventure. If you want to sit there and read about history, it's fine. But what I really encourage people to do is take the booklet or book and go out in the community and look around. Great example, talk a little bit about the Hoosier Theater and its history. It's a 1920s movie palace. There's a great deal of history on 1920 movie palaces, and we've got one. Not only read the book about what the theater means to the community and about its history, but get out there tonight and watch those cartoons and sit in those seats, or go to the Whiting Library and take a look around and see an original Carnegie Library, which has been altered but been preserved, when most communities knock those down. A treasure trove of a building. Go over to the Whiting Community Center.
Absolutely.
And start looking around that building. And there's a building that is using its same function since the time it was open, has an amazing history, and it's still the same building. And you can actually walk out there and touch the history and see the history.
For listeners who don't know, David is probably the premier authority on history of Whiting Robertsdale. Seriously, I think most people would agree. He knows, he's a local attorney, folks, but he knows more than I'll ever know about Whiting Robertsdale, although I'll take credit and claim I do. Nonetheless, David, explain a little bit. A few people have asked before about the design of the pavilion over at Wolf Lake, the new performance pavilion, and why the influence of the Prairie Style and Frank Lloyd Wright. Can you explain the original plans that Frank Lloyd Wright had for Wolf Lake for a minute?
Actually, if you want to see a copy of them, we have a copy in the book, and I was very happy that the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation let me use that photograph. The original plan, I mean, Wolf Lake in itself has just an amazing history. It has that sort of 3-way tug of war where there's never a real victor. You have those who want to preserve it as in its natural state, those who want to make it a recreational area, which is like Frank Lloyd Wright's backer wanted to do, and then you have those people who wanted to destroy it in its entirety. And you have a real struggle over the years. I think an amazing story as to how that lake gets preserved. Again, talking about the state of Indiana, but the proposal was that Frank Lloyd Wright was at that time in the late 1890s. He was approached to build essentially an amusement park. It's called a casino, and that's, if you look at the references to his work, you'll see the reference to a casino. It's not a casino in terms of gambling and poker and blackjack or whatever they do at the casinos. It's actually just sort of like the building on Lakeshore Drive south of Jackson Park. That's called a casino as well. It has sort of columns or colonnades, and it's an incredible piece of architecture designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. If you had gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York a few years ago, they had a major presentation of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, and the piece of work that they chose to put on their posters and to promote that show was actually the proposal that he had for Wolf Lake.